You can only maintain those reciprocal labor institutions if you say no to someone who wants to be totally weird and crazy and wacky and do their own thing. You need to punish dissent, etc. I want to add another fun point about geography. There's some nice research by Martin Fisbane, who's Argentinian, and he has a new paper out looking at how crop type affects human cooperation. In parts of America where the only crop you could grow required lots and lots of labor, people had to cooperate more. And in those societies and in those communities, they tended to give their children common names. Like they wanted to conform. They didn't want to stand out from the crowd. And even today, people are more likely to be much more communal, to favor team sports. In China, in East Asia, people grow rice. And that is very, very heavily labor intensive. And Thomas Talhelm, an economist, theorizes that that gave rise to East Asia's collectivist culture because people needed to cooperate in building irrigation, in transplanting seedlings. That made them a much more culturally tight society. And now there's a Latin American example, I theorize at least, I speculate. So growing potatoes in the Andes was very, very labor intensive because what they do, and it's very special to the Andes, is not only do they grow the potatoes, but then they leave them out at night to freeze them, and then in the day they will dry in the sun. And this process takes 5 days. So it's a very labor intensive process, and it's very special to the Andes. You're only able to do this because it's very cold and then very hot. Right? And this was very important because by freeze drying the potatoes, they last much longer because otherwise they would just rot. So the potatoes were super, super important. It enabled them to transport and feed soldiers, for example, in the Inca Empire. Right. There's also very nice evidence from 1,000 years ago looking at skeletons across what is now Peru. And they find that in the highland areas, the bones show much more wear and tear, which suggests that people were working very, very hard. Whereas in the coastal lowland areas, their skeletons have much less wear and tear. And today in Peru, in the highland areas, rural and urban women work at very, very high rates. It's like 90% of women are in the labor force. And they also have this very strong conception, as of what I was saying earlier, of minga reciprocal labor, that people help each other in their community. Peruvians also have these very strong ideas of conformity and ideas of kinship and ideas of collectivism and also socially policing their group. So I think the Andean potato is a nice example of how a crop, when you happen to live on a mountain, that the crop you grow for your absolute advantage is very labor intensive, that encourages all these reciprocal labor institutions, which in turn give rise to a culture of interdependence and collectivism and cooperation with far less support for someone being individualistic. You can only maintain those reciprocal labor institutions if you say no to someone who wants to be totally weird and crazy and wacky and do their own thing. You need to punish dissent, etc. So whereas wheat, for example, does not require much labor, it does not require much interdependence. So wheat growing cultures tend to be much more individualistic. So Italians, for example, going back, and Greeks, for example, they grew wheat, and that culture would have been much more individualistic. So yeah, there's a lot. So geography can shape culture. It's not the only thing. Even among wheat-grown cultures, we see a lot of heterogeneity, right? Egyptians are very different from Italians today. And that, we need to trace the whole history of that. Anyway, so that was another example of geography.